Welcome to the Big Fellas Podcast, where we chop it up about all things past, present, and future about the game of basketball. Where facts, stats, and context reign supreme.
That is blasphemous!
Sometimes it gets crazy, but we always keep it real. Get ready to learn from players, coaches, and fans from all levels of the game and see the court in a brand new way. And now, fresh off the sidelines, here's your host, John Hartofilis.
What it do, fellas, and welcome to the Big Fellas Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, JH, coming to you from New York City, the mecca of basketball. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Reiner J. Meisterjahn, founder of Courtex Performance. We spoke about how Reiner built his own brand in the mental performance space, where he sees the field going, and why we have to throw away the cookie-cutter approach. We've got a good one in store for you today, fellas. Episode number 44, Reiner J. Meisterjahn, NBA, WNBA, and FIBA mental performance coach. Hi, Reiner. What's going on?
Hey, not much. You know, things are finally starting to quiet down after the draft. Excited for this next NBA season coming up.
You and me both. Like, I really can't wait for it to get started. We're about yesterday was a month out of the start of the season, so we're really looking forward to when that finally kicks off. Just to kind of get started on your career, if you can kind of tell our listeners kind of just a little bit about what you do and maybe how you even got started in the mental conditioning game.
Yeah, so you know, obviously my background is in mental performance or sports psychology. So some people might call it. When I was about 13 years old, I got into basketball, so pretty late in life, but really fell in love with the sport, started playing it. You know, and this was back in Germany, which is where I'm from originally. So, you know, got pretty decent at it. Eventually came over to the States, had the opportunity to play in college. That was up in Maine. Played for a small school up there and majored in psychology. And that's where I came across the field of sports psychology because we had a elective at the time that I had a chance to take. And that's what really, I think, sparked my interest at the time. And you know, that's when I realized, man, like there's a way for me to combine my passions into a career, you know. And from there, kind of fast forward a couple of years, I went into a master's program in counseling psychology initially at Frostburg State University out in Maryland. You know, then took the performance route after that and went to Tennessee for my doctorate studies in kinesiology and sports psychology. You know, that led me then to start my business, Courtex Performance, a couple of years after that. So here we are. What is it, like seven, almost 8 years in, and things are going pretty well. So.
That's great to hear, and it's super cool to kind of get this perspective from a mental performance coach on the game and what your job is like. What did figuring that out for yourself look like?
You know, I say this, I know you have a bit of a background in business. I really didn't at the time. Like, I had no idea. I just knew that I wanted to do something, and, you know, I had explored a couple of different other options as far as do I go into, you know, academia and become a professor. That kind of fell through for me, which I'm glad it did because it wouldn't have been the best fit for me. You know, I also tried to get on with a NBA organization early on, but that was incredibly difficult at that point just because I didn't have the resume for it. So thinking about, well, like, what do I want to do in terms of starting a business? What could that look like? What's going to be my unique edge? How do I want to go about my branding? You know, I started out with a couple of clients, you know, maybe a couple of high school players or something like that. You know, put together a website myself, very amateurish, not professional at all, to be honest, you know, but, you know, just kind of kept building from there. And one thing I did well early on, I think, is I was pretty good at networking and just reaching out to folks and building connections, volunteering my time, you know, building relationships through other means, not directly through mental training, but even in terms of, you know, just getting out on the court with a guy like Tobias Harris. He sees his jersey in the background. You know, like I used to like go rebound for him, different things. You know, once I started building more of those connections, the business started growing more and more, and you know, started becoming more professional. I, you know, got at this point I have a business manager, so she's been instrumental in helping me kind of take my next steps. You know, as far as you know, building out a staff around me, you know, professionalizing some of our services, you know, recruiting more clients. But again, very, you know, very kind of messy, random start to this journey. But if I could go back, you know, I'm not sure I'd do it over again because you learn a lot in the process. So, you know, I'm happy where we're at now. And it's, like I said, it's going pretty well.
Oh, super exciting. And just off the thought of that start, because I do a lot of research, I'm kind of crazy about it. I saw your dissertation about how everything was different, and it's about just the psychology of players when they go overseas. And a lot of people here in the States don't understand that. I think if you can kind of go into that, it'll give our listeners a really good picture of kind of what you do, but also like what you found out through your studies.
Yeah, you really did do your research. That's that's awesome. So for my dissertation, again, me coming from Germany, but then at that point, having lived in the States for some time, I was really curious about how American players perceive their experiences in going overseas, both in terms of on court and off court. And so I interviewed a number of guys that had made that journey, and found out that while basketball on the court, I mean, there are some differences in terms of rules and how the game is being called and how the game is being played and whatnot. But really, what stood out to guys the most was just the difference off the court. Adjusting to the language, figuring out how you fit into the culture, figuring out how you build a life as opposed to being in your room all day and just playing PlayStation or something like that. Yeah, and I think that's what's really most challenging is navigating those aspects of being in that foreign culture, far away from family. Of course, nowadays, I mean, technology is a lot better now than it used to be, so it does make it a bit easier. But I remember even talking to a guy who's since become a close friend of mine, and when he started his journey, I mean, that there was, you didn't have Skype and Zoom and FaceTime and all those different type of things. I mean, it was challenging back then, and now the bigger challenge I think for guys is figuring out how to take advantage of the cultural experience and really embrace that challenge as opposed to leaning on their families too much through technology, because a lot of guys that struggle with even with mental health overseas, or that end up just having a short career overseas, those are the ones that are just on their device all day and never get out, never. I mean, shoot, like, it's such a great experience, right, to like be in Germany, be in Greece, be in Spain, but I think a lot of players don't really, like, they're scared to take advantage of that, I think, because it's so unfamiliar.
It's so interesting to kind of think about how important that mental side is for those players coming from the US to have success overseas. Off air, we had spoken about when you were working with the Bucks in the early 2010s, and you had gotten the chance to meet Giannis right after he came from Greece. What did you kind of notice in him, kind of with the opposite effect? He's coming from overseas to the United States. Was there a difference with how he kind of reacted compared to how maybe a US player would react going over there? What did you see?
I mean, he was so young, right? So you had the language barrier, you had, just the whole getting acclimated. I remember us, I think I told you, like, the two of us and Ross Geiger, who was the assistant video guy for the Bucks at the time, and ended up building a close relationship with Giannis. I remember us going to a restaurant and having lunch together, and Giannis, like, he had no idea how to order at that time and just wasn't familiar with the food or any of the cultural aspects. And I remember end up ordering a couple of entrees and put those away probably faster than I could put away one meal. But I think the big thing was, and I can speak for myself in that regard as well. When you come over, and obviously we know that Giannis came from very little. He essentially grew up in poverty, and I didn't. But regardless, you come over here to the States, and I think what stands out is just this sense of abundance. Like, there's just so much abundance in terms of food and just shopping and just everything. It's just such a culture of convenience, I almost want to say, relative to what we oftentimes experience in Europe. So yeah, I would imagine that was almost overwhelming for him. I never had a chance to get to know him like that, but when you come from very little and now you come into all this and you do it not even as an average person, but as an NBA player, it's a lot. It's exciting and overwhelming at the same time, I think.
Especially for Giannis to have a complete 180 in terms of playing in the second division of Greece, and then a couple months later he's in the NBA living his dream. So that's great to kind of think about. Back onto the idea of Courtex, can you kind of talk to us about what Courtex's philosophy is when it comes to mental performance training and what your real goal is trying to get out of these players?
Yeah, so one thing that we really emphasize and stress with our players, coaches, and executives is that mental training should be done proactively and systematically. And it should be completely customized and personalized to the individual. So it's a little bit different from how I think it's been done traditionally. I think traditionally, mental training too often has been sort of reactive, to where players, and we still have players coming in sometimes, and their starting point is something like, "Hey, I'm going through a shooting slump. My confidence is down, et cetera, et cetera." So we always try to move them to a more proactive, approach that's really built on take responses as opposed to reactions, if that makes sense. So we look at it as strength and conditioning for the mind, so to speak, to where you know invest in your mental game, and you have a regularity to how you go about your on and off court mental skills training, and building out a skill set that ultimately helps you squeeze out another 1, 2, 3%, even when you're already at the level of, say, a Tobias Harris, for instance. And that's what it's really all about. And the other piece, like I mentioned, is that it has to be customized and personalized to the individual. So I think too often in sports psychology and mental training, we come at athletes and coaches with kind of a cookie cutter blanket type of approach that doesn't take into account the uniqueness of each person, and what their desires are, how they go about learning and processing information, what their goals are. You know what I mean? So that's where we really try to be creative and make it fun, and make our approach adaptable to what the individual wants and needs.
Well, it's definitely so important to not have that cookie cutter mentality, and treat everyone as an individual. And it's interesting when you talk about how like that's the mistake sometimes people make when it comes to whether it's neglecting the importance of really focusing on mental health and that sort of thing. A lot of NBA players have recently been very open in talking about it, whether it's Kevin Love, guys like that. What do you kind of see in terms of the growth of that becoming something that people are willing to talk about?
I think more and more players are starting to find that courage to be vulnerable, you know. And I think it's so foundational to everything we do. Not, at Courtex, we don't really do too much in the mental health space. We're more so concerned with mental performance, and then maybe with mental skills and mental wellness to a degree, if that makes sense. So obviously we've had players like Kevin Love, like DeRozan, come out and talk about more clinical things like depression. But regardless, whether that's a starting point or somebody is struggling to a lesser degree and is just simply like wanting to figure out a path to excellence, I think just having that courage to be vulnerable, to be open, to address what's going on mentally, again, I think it's so foundational, and it's been missing for the longest time, right? So it's really amazing that some of these guys are starting to open up, because it's going to make it a lot easier for a lot of other players to kind of follow in their footsteps, and it's going to make it easier, hopefully, for our field as a whole to move towards a more proactive approach as far as mental training is concerned.
When it comes to what's already been done in terms of progressing the field, how do you see this whole mental performance field growing in the next 5 to 10 years? Like, what do you see really changing?
Well, I think it's going to be the next big wave. Okay, kind of like when you think about the NBA space, for instance, you had that analytics wave maybe about, I'm trying to think when that started. It's probably been like 15 years now, 10, 15 years ago, whatever the case may be. Prior to that, you had the big strength and conditioning wave. Now you have a lot of the sports science stuff that's been relatively new in recent years, and is starting to be built out as far as more comprehensive sports science departments inside NBA organizations. Now, mental performance falls under that sports science umbrella, but it's probably the one aspect that to date really hasn't been integrated as specifically, I would say. That's not true for all organizations, but I would say for the vast majority of them, though. So I'm guessing that, and I'm predicting that it's going to be one of the next big things that's going to start to evolve here in the next 5 to 10 years, to where players are going to be, players and coaches and executives as well, they're going to start utilizing it as something that is a part of their day-to-day, as opposed to, again, it just being something that's sort of reactive. So I'm pretty excited about it. I mean, there are technologies that potentially be brought in to help facilitate some of that, and there are different ways of incorporating it with existing performance programs on the physical side.
That's super interesting. And especially when you brought up beginning how analytics kind of play a role in players being proactive in that. How do you guys work hand in hand maybe with an analytics department to come to a conclusion?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm really excited to build out in the future, and then this is going to take more resources, I would say, but we have messed around with behavioral tracking, for instance. So specifically tracking on-court behavior for players by watching film. Things like how many times per game do they hang their head because they're disappointed about a missed shot or something like that. How many times per game do they show poor next play speed after there's a none call, when they got fouled. How much do they use their body language to communicate offensively and defensively? How many positive touches per game do players give to one another? So I think long term, and maybe sooner than that, collaborating with analytics departments to tap into some of those type of performance statistics to see how they might correlate with your points per game, with your shooting percentages, with your effort statistics like rebounding, et cetera. I think that could be so exciting, and it's kind of a long path ahead. Like I said, we've done some of that by hand, in terms of just counting behavior on film, but I'm hoping we can build it out, more with more resources.
Which I'm blown away by that, because when you think of analytics, and when you always hear about coaches talking about how keep track of Steve Nash giving 300 touches a game, that was the thing that I always heard, and it was like, okay, like that's important. Like I was a young player thinking, okay, I have to keep on giving touches, I have to keep on picking my teammates up, keep your head up. You always hear that, but to know that you guys are tracking it is so cool. That really stuck out to me, that it's not just something that people talk about, it's something that's being tracked and improved upon.
Yeah, and like long term, like I said, it'd be awesome to be able to track it in on a bigger scale, to where you can do it across an entire team or something like that. Right now, one thing that we've done with some of our clients is that we develop out custom behaviors that the players want to focus on more in game, because those behaviors might enhance their effort or their feeling of confidence or their leadership, for instance. So we'll track how many times per game a specific player might clap, for instance. That's a key behavior that they choose to focus on. On the flip side, we also look at negative behaviors that they're looking to decrease, and kind of finding at least subjectively a somewhat optimal range. So when it comes to, say, displaying some anger in your body language, that's something that we try to obviously help players keep to a minimum by tracking it, but there's also a bit of a threshold to where you don't want the player to be too flat. So maybe having 0 instances of showing any type of frustration during game isn't optimal either. Maybe a player seems to perform the best when they're at in that, like, say, 3 to 5 range. And again, it's customized to each player based on what feels right to them, based on how their performance typically looks game to game. It's been great as far as just helping players build awareness, because a lot of the time they know that they got to pick up their body language, or they got to be more focused, or they got to be more positive. But the more you can attach specific numbers to that, whether it's hard counts or even ratings across, say, their core values or something like that, the easier it is for the player to make concrete adjustments.
And it goes back to your earlier point too, when you were talking about how you can't really be cookie cutter. It's interesting, because I was just thinking about now, like when you're saying how some players, you don't want them to be flat and show no emotion. It's interesting how, like, everyone's different, and Kawhi Leonard is going to react differently to what's on the floor than Russell Westbrook will. Than Jordan will, like we saw. And actually, that's a great point that just came to mind, is what you thought of in the Jordan documentary, how Jordan was talking about his mental performance and how he took it personally. And that kind of became a meme online, but it really spoke true to the legend that was Michael Jordan, in terms of when you tested him mentally, it just brought out a different side of him. What did you kind of see or think about that?
Right. I would say Jordan and I'd put Kobe in that same bucket. Competitively, they're wired differently from the vast majority of players. So guys that always seek that competitive challenge and might tell themselves a story sometimes just to get their competitive senses heightened, so to speak. I was a big Reggie Miller fan growing up, actually. So I loved how Reggie would always pick out somebody in the crowd. And I guess you're a New York guy, right? So I'm sure you weren't too fond of him.
I wasn't around at the time. I was like 5 years from being born, but.
Yeah, okay, you're young. But, I'm sure you've heard the stories, But so I loved how someone like Reggie, like he would pick out somebody in the crowd to pick on, or you'd get into it with Spike Lee or he would just find ways to really, get his competitive arousal up, so to speak. And I think that's where like Jordan and Kobe were unique as well, as far as, killer instinct and that, ferocity in which they went about the game. And that's great. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, is that when I talk to players now, and a lot of players of this generation, they don't remember Jordan as much as they remember Kobe. And everybody always tries to emulate Kobe, in terms of mindset. And I think you can do that to a degree, but I oftentimes caution players and encourage them to figure out their own way, because trying to channel that Kobe mindset isn't necessarily right if that's not your personality. There might be a different way to go about your competitive approach. I mean, guys like Tim Duncan, LeBron, I'd put LeBron in a different bucket as well. Nowitzki, I love Nowitzki growing up because I'm German. All those guys were great competitors in their own right, but wired differently from Kobe and Jordan, I would say. And that's perfectly fine. So you got to find your own way to, tap into your mental game and maximize it based on what your unique personality makeup is.
And it's a great way to wrap up the show in terms of not just talking about Mamba mentality, but in bringing it all together with what you said earlier about how Tim Duncan, LeBron, all those guys are great competitors, and they do have that desire to compete at the highest level. The way they express or the way they're wired is just a little bit different from Kobe and Jordan in terms of they still have that Mamba mentality. It just expressed differently and comes out differently. So thank you so much for coming on. I think this was a great episode. I learned so much about the mental side that I didn't know before in terms of how you guys track it and really what you guys do behind the scenes. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks for listening to the Big Fellas Podcast. Check us out on all major social media platforms at Big Fellas Pod to join the chop up. You can also listen to us on every podcast platform on the planet. Stay tuned for the next episode, Big Fellas.